This selection of verses at the end of the book of Matthew is typically called the Great Commission. Some have referred to it as the Great Omission, not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it's not something that is an active part of many Christians' lives. There are others for whom this is very central. One of those is a guy named David Livingstone, or was a guy named David Livingstone. I'll talk more about him a bit later. This actually was his favorite verse, and it was one that was absolutely key to him, most especially the last section that has a slightly different highlight. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, or some translations will say, even to the end of the world. Interesting, when the scriptures speak about time into the future, it's typically referred to as the age, the end of the age. And the idea really being and presented in scripture that the future is a sequence of ages. So these are the last words we have recorded in the book of Matthew with regards to Jesus. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That's fairly complete. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, that word lo could just be translated behold, and it is the idea that pay special attention to this. Okay, the idea that Jesus is with us always. And so this particular section is typically taken as a command, and we've spoken about it before, and so most of you are aware that it's actually not a command, although in the English translation and in almost every English translation, it appears as a command, go. In English classes, let's say seventh grade, they would call that a hortative. It's a command. It's an instruction to do something. You are mandated to go and do something. But in fact, it is not a hortative. It is not a command. It is a gerund. Okay, so this morning is seventh grade English for a little bit. And what's a gerund? A gerund is when you take a verb and turn it into a noun by adding ing, at least in English, that's what it is. So run becomes running, and go becomes going. Well, this is a gerund in the Greek, in the original. So what we read is a translation of the Greek. Now, Jesus may have spoken this in Greek. He may have spoken it in Aramaic. But whichever he spoke it in, what is recorded in the scriptures is the Greek. Matthew's epistle that we have is written in the Greek. And if you were reading it as a Greek or as a Greek-speaking person reading the Greek, you would say, oh, this is not a command. This is an expectation. It's a gerund. And it really says, going, therefore, make disciples. Or in your going, make disciples. In other words, as you go about your day to day. It's not take off and go to Borneo and make disciples there. That was one of my concerns, frankly. If I really commit myself to the Lord, is he going to send me to Borneo? I don't want to go to Borneo. Well, I don't know anybody who's gone to Borneo, but certainly there have been people who have been sent out as missionaries. And there are some for whom that is God's plan for them. And then that becomes obvious to them. But the average Christian, it's bloom where you're planted. The expectation is that your life and your words will result in disciples surrounding you that are birthed by your life. when people see how you live and you put words to that so that they understand why you live the way you live, then they'll be drawn to Jesus. I mean, God's goal is to turn us all into a picture of Jesus. When somebody sees us, that they might see Jesus. And notice that he starts out, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That's complete, total, absolute authority, meaning all resources then would be available to us. Now, the challenge that we know that we run into is that we're not always aware that we have the resources. That in fact, many of us get quite concerned that we don't have what we need. We haven't been trained enough. We don't have the words. There's the fear. It's a very real fear. If you're going to share the gospel, I don't want to screw this up, or I'm not sure what to say. I don't want to be offensive. And the scriptures make clear God will give us the words. And in my experience, the most effective sharers of the gospel quite often are brand new believers. They don't know enough to be afraid. And in John chapter 4, you see the woman at the well and a Samaritan woman. She doesn't have great background in the gospel. She doesn't have great background in theology. All she knows is there's this guy that she met who changed her life and knew everything about her. And so she goes and tells her friends, and it seems like pretty much the whole town turns to Jesus because of this woman who didn't know any better. So let's consider Memorial Day. All right. So it was founded in 1868, we think. There are other claims to when it really started, but General John A. Logan, who was commander-in-chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was it was kind of like Veterans of Foreign Wars. It was a similar type of organization. In that case, it was specifically members of the Union Army after the Civil War. He issued an order to decorate the graves and to honor Civil War dead. And the primary focus at that point was the Union. Now we honor all dead. But it was to go out and decorate the graves. And before it was called Memorial Day, it was called Decoration Day. And when I was a kid, I recall it being referred to as Decoration Day, and then some would say Memorial Day. And the whole idea was that we should not forget the heroes of the past, the ones who have made it possible for us to live the lives that we do. And so I thought it might make sense to consider at least one of the heroes of the past for us in the battle that we're involved with. We are soldiers in a war. If you consider it, the imagery of soldiers appears everywhere. We know we have an enemy, okay, and certainly that's part of what creates the necessity to be a soldier, somebody fighting against you. We're called to defend ourselves. In fact, we're even told what armor to wear, what weapons to carry, in Ephesians chapter 6. And we're told that there is a spiritual war going on. And we may not see it with our eyes, but we know that it's happening. And you see evil that seeks to take over every aspect of our culture. And it is more palpable now than ever before. And yet, we know the enemy has been vanquished, but the battles are still going on. And so I would suggest that we honor one of our heroes. And as I thought about it, a hero very well worthy of honor is David Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone. He was a medical missionary to Africa. Now, he became a doctor specifically so that he could be a missionary. He had to convince his father, who had been a very gifted Sunday school teacher and speaker, didn't think it made any sense for him to be a doctor. He said, just go out and share the gospel. But Livingstone ultimately convinced him that it would make sense for him to go to medical school, and that caring for people's physical needs was part of what he was called to do in fulfilling the command of Jesus. And so he spoke one time. He had gone back and forth between his native Scotland, and also he spoke in London. He spoke elsewhere, and then he would go back to his mission in Africa. And he was one time, as he was older, speaking at the University of Glasgow. By the way, he was born in 1813, died in 1873 at 60 years of age. So that was his era. Um, and at the University of Glasgow, not too different from some of the universities today, the students customarily heckled the speakers. Now, I'm not sure that they were protesting, they were just mocking the speakers. But when he spoke, there was absolute quiet. And he said, "Shall I tell you what sustained me in the midst of all the terrible trials?" Because he had gone through and he had shared with them everything he had been through, and it was incredible. Um, and he says, "What sustained me was a promise given by a gentleman of the most sacred honor. And it was this promise, and it's what we just read this morning. Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." Okay, and so in our lifetime, then, we can know that Jesus is with us and that there is the power that he provides to us to deal with any obstacle, to deal with any challenge, to deal with any difficulty. Now, Livingstone was a soldier. He had wounds, physical wounds. He suffered a lion attack. He had his arm nearly torn off, his left arm, had the bone badly broken. It was set and reset, and he recovered to some degree, but he could never lift his arm above his shoulder. It was always weaker, and he had pain. He had rheumatic fever, multiple bouts. He had malaria. In 1 year, he had malarial attacks 30 times. He was half blind. He had been attacked by natives, and he had been attacked by Turkish slave traders, not just Turks, but the various Arabs, particularly in Eastern Europe, I'm sorry, Eastern Africa, who attacked him. Um, the natives attacked him. The native Africans attacked him because he was a white man, and therefore they presumed that he was a slave trader. And the Arabs attacked him because um, he kept interfering with the slave trade. In fact, his goal was to end the slave trade totally, completely, particularly focusing on Eastern Africa, but going throughout Africa, um, whether it was Botswana or Somaliland. He was working to destroy the slave trade. And he believed that the best way he could do it was to find the headwaters of the Nile. He felt that the honor that that would bring to him would give him greater credibility, and that he would be able to use that and leverage it to convince people to terminate the slave trade. And he had a simple saying, and it was the three C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. And he said, by bringing Christianity to Africa, we will bring commerce and the end of the slave trade. We will bring civilization. And he felt that that would completely change Africa. He suffered as he crossed the desert. He was hungry. He wound up fasting intentionally and unintentionally many, many times, and was near death multiple times. He wound up incredibly thirsty, couldn't find water at times. He ate and carried with him dried corn. He When he couldn't walk, he was carried on a stretcher. Um, he had spiritual wounds as well. Crossing the desert, his son died. Uh, his father died. And then, worst of all, his wife, Mary, died in his arms as he held her under a baobab tree. But he had great victories. He brought the gospel to thousands of villages, literally. He walked, he walked. And he walked when he came first, when he was young. He walked when he was old. And when he couldn't walk, they carried him on a stretcher from town to town. Um, he was carried. And if you look at his travels in Africa, he went east and west and east and west. And then after he went north and south, basically making the sign of the cross on Africa. And his efforts bore fruit. In most places, he ended the slave trade. Wherever he traveled, the slave trade was badly damaged or destroyed. Um, And then there was a period of time where the dispatches that he would regularly send back and would be printed in the newspapers stopped. And for 4 years, nobody heard from David Livingstone. He was lost somewhere in Africa. And so James Gordon Bennett, who was the editor of the New York Herald, sent Henry Stanley to find Dr. Livingstone. And he went into the deepest jungle. I think he went up the Zambezi River and he found Dr. Livingstone. And as he approached him and he saw him, he said the words that have since been made somewhat famous, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And of course, Livingstone acknowledged who he was. The charge that Stanley had was to bring back news on Livingstone, and he stayed with Dr. Livingstone and lived with him, and he saw his life, and he wound up being discipled by Dr. David Livingstone. Stanley himself had been an atheist. And he was just going for the story. This was a big, big story at that time. Finding Dr. Livingstone. What he didn't expect was that his life would be changed. And Stanley became a very effective speaker afterward that, and even to some degrees an evangelist. But he was converted by the life of Dr. David Livingstone. And so you can understand how Livingstone, as he traveled, reached people not just by sharing the gospel, but by sharing his life. And when he died in prayer. They found him in his tent, kneeling down at his bedside. He was horribly sick, had been, died of the malaria, died of internal bleeding, had multiple issues. But he just took this body as far as he possibly could in a land that had treated him so poorly, at least physically and spiritually. But he was committed. It was not just, Lord, I accept you, guide my life. It was whatever it takes, whatever it takes. You know, you think of the words of Paul in Philippians where he says, I press on, you know, and that pressing on for the high calling. And that I want to be like him in his life, in his death. I mean, and to know the fellowship of his suffering. Well, that was David Livingstone. He was a modern Paul. And he had prayed, Lord, send me anywhere, only go with me. And that's what happened. That's what happened. Incredible story. If you've never read a life of David Livingstone, I would highly encourage it. Now, Africa, he had an impact, but I can tell you I've been to Africa multiple times and will likely go again. and they struggle, and they struggle um, because they desperately still need Christianity. Not everywhere, but there's so many countries that are Christian, but you've seen the Muslim takeover of much of Africa. Northern Africa, of course, for years has been Muslim, and now you're seeing Central Africa and Eastern Africa, Somalis and others have long since been overtaken. And one of their key methods is to outbreed the competition, if you will. They'll have 5, 6, or 10 children. And it's, the fact that they practice polygamy only increases the number of children that a man can have. And in most cases, the women will have their first child in their mid-teens. Whereas what we see, I was just in Italy, and the Uber driver was talking to us about the horrible problem they have in Italy, and that is that the birth rate is just slightly over 1, and it's not enough to replace them, and that the migrants who have come up primarily from Northern Africa have this incredibly high birth rate, and it was I talked about the fact that in, a decade or two, Italy is not going to be made up of a majority of Italians. He also shared with us some interesting things that there are 5 different police forces that they have, and each police force has a different limitation. So there's one just for the cars. And if they go up to you, they can check your license and they can check your registration and basic things like that. But if there's a crime going on, that's not their purview. That's not their area. There's another police force for that and so on. And they went through, I don't remember all 5 right now. But he shared with us some of the interesting things there. He said, yeah, you have to watch out for pregnant women. And they he said he said the police are not allowed to arrest a pregnant woman. Therefore, for the gypsies, a pregnant woman can steal from you or come up to you on the street, commit a crime, whatever, but the police can't touch her. It's very strange. But anyway, they, as you think about it, you've got the life of somebody like David Livingstone, and he believed that is what was necessary in his case to reach Africa. Now, the times I've been in Africa, what I've seen is they're cash-based societies. Now, when you see a cash-based society, that means that there isn't trust. To get to a credit-based society, you need to have people able to trust one another. Well, how does that trust develop? Well, the Greek word, it's the Latin word for credit, where we get our word credit, is credito, to trust. But how do you develop trust? The fact that you are trustworthy does not mean that you automatically get credit. Rather, someone has to decide to believe that they can trust you. How does that happen? Well, Christianity tends to encourage that we trust one another. And you know that you can trust someone because God will take care of you. In fact, in Philippians, it even talks about the necessity to be willing to be taken advantage of. So the creditor has to have that in mind, that I may lose if I help this person, but God calls me to help this person. And what we have today, where we have a society in which credit is normal, that is a fruit of Christianity. Now, it's also a fruit amongst the Jews of Judaism, because you see, for example, in Proverbs, it says, a gift to someone in need or a gift to the poor is a loan to God. The fact that God sees, God knows, and God repays, and God is not going to let you be taken advantage of without Him intervening on your behalf. But you have to have that willingness and trust God rather than man. We're moving away from that, obviously, and we've seen the challenges in our society as a result. Right now, I'd like to just spend a few moments, and if perhaps there's some folks here who would share people in their family or loved ones or that they've known who have sacrificed in the military or on the mission field for the Lord. So I want to just stop here and ask you, to please, let us know what you've seen, what in lives that have been inspirational for you.
Well, if I could start out, Ron, my dad and five of his brothers all were in World War II. It's pretty rare that you would have that many, six brothers in World War II. And I'm very thankful for all that they did in World War II, for which I am very grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, that's reminiscent of the Sullivan brothers. The movie Saving Private Ryan actually was based on the Sullivan brothers, where all but one were killed in battle, and they sought to keep the last one from likewise being killed. We're moving away from that, obviously, and we've seen the challenges in our society as a result.